Sustainable Ann Arbor Forum, Adapting to a Changing Climate, in partnership with the City of Ann Arbor.
Up here with me is my very good friend and a vanguard in the climate adaptation movement, Beth Gibbons. Beth is someone who, I will read her bio, but I told her I was going to do this too, is someone who cares deeply and passionately about this work and is instrumental in building a field of folks who identify themselves as adaptation professionals. She is incredibly smart, compassionate, and is really leading the movement to put equity and social cohesion front and center in the work that we do. And I think that's often not recognized and absolutely essential. So let me give you her introduction just so you can understand about why I adore her as much as I do. Beth is the Executive Director of the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, which, if you put that together, stands for ASAP. Very well done. In this role, she's responsible for strengthening ASAP as an emerging nonprofit organization, managing relationships with its members, board, and donors, and bringing adaptation it says best practices, I'm going to challenge her to say promising practices, into the broader conversation. Previously, Beth was director of the University of Michigan's Climate Center and managed NOAA Great Lakes Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessment, GLESA, for those who might know it. She also worked with the Graham Environmental Sustainability Institute as a research specialist, helping develop and implement the Great Lakes Adaptation Assessment for cities, GLACI, if you've ever heard of it. Previously, Beth worked for the International Forestry and Research Institute and the General Federation of Women's Clubs, supporting organizational operations and communications. She served in the Peace Corps in Togo, and Beth earned her undergraduate degree in Comparative Politics from the Catholic University of America and holds a Master's of Urban Planning and a Master's Certificate in African Studies from the University of Michigan. She's based in Ypsilanti, but was previously in Ann Arbor, and I adore her. So please join me in welcoming Beth. So before, I know, right? I was going to totally turn it over to you, and then I didn't. I just wanted to make sure you all got to hear about her. We're going to do something. We're going to do a little trivia really quick that's going to kind of ground our conversation. So you silence those phones, bring them on out. If you've got a phone on you. If not, sit next to someone who does. I also want to introduce my fabulous colleague, Emily Drennan, who's the sustainability analyst for the office. She is a hero and does amazing Herculean work. So on your phone, you see your first question. How much is saved by investing $1 in resilience? Stop changing your answers. No, I'm just kidding. All right. Okay, with 49 votes in, the winner is 10. We got 50 votes? Okay, so we think it's 10. Beth, what's the answer?
The answer is $6.
Correct. That is from a study commissioned by FEMA. So we know, but the point.
Which is actually a recent increase. Previously, we had been costing this at $4 of $1 investment, where it was worth $4 in impact. But a recent study that came out in 2018 updated that information. So now we're recognizing that a single dollar spent in resilience will save $6 post-disaster.
Pretty good investment. Well, with the disasters increasing the way they are, we could have that conversation. All right, so let's go on, Emily, to the next question. So the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services has specified 5 priority health risks for Michigan. Try and pick some. So you should have the option of picking a few. All right. Some pretty nice divides here. We're going to go ahead and close it. Do you want to click through? All right, the answers. Beth, would you like to share?
So the top 5 health risks identified in the 2015 report from MDHHS were respiratory diseases, heat-related illness, waterborne diseases, vector-borne diseases, and injury and carbon monoxide poisoning. And this one I think is really interesting for us to pause on because it actually illuminates the way that climate impacts are something that we need to contend with both in the winter months as well as in the summer months. I was just recently out in Grand Rapids where they had school closed 10 of the last 13 days. The City of Grand Rapids Public Schools has used more school closings in this year than they did in the previous decade. Along with that, the ice storms that have occurred have knocked power out for days at a time. And it's those power outages related to increased ice storms, another which is predicted for tomorrow, as well as severe summer storms that put us at risk for monoxide poisoning. People are purchasing generators, they're running them, they're not venting them, they're using them incorrectly, and we see this increasing risk and increasing number of deaths from monoxide poisoning.
Thanks, Beth. All right, next question. What was the most expensive disaster of 2018? All right, looks like we're pretty saturated. You are correct. It is the Camp Fire.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, there you go. That's just that. How much water does a mature tree absorb annually? All right. 2,300 gallons of water.
So I think that this is a great statistic because it's one of the ways that we can illuminate strategies that are both related to climate mitigation and climate adaptation. So when we think about climate action, there's two sides of this coin. There's mitigation, which is the work that we do to reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere and to reduce the amount of carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere. Trees are essential in this effort. They sequester carbon, they capture carbon. Additionally, on the climate action front, we have adaptation. Adaptation are the actions that we must take because of the carbon that we've already put out into the atmosphere, and I'll be talking about that in my presentation. Trees provide us this beautiful merger where you can plant trees so that they will be sequestering carbon, and for an area like Ann Arbor, where there's been a 45% increase in precipitation since 1950, we know that we need more natural infrastructure to absorb that precipitation, and trees play a role in that. So we see these as a perfect element of our adaptation mitigation strategies.
Let's also not forget that trees provide a cooling effect as well. So as we're dealing with heat, there's that added value for sure. So as we move on towards the end of our survey, thank you all for participating. The next question. Oh, let's see if you listened to Beth. That's not the answer. Well, we might be able to skip this one. You all were listening. Well, not all of you. A few of you weren't clearly listening, but most of you were listening. Just mix it up for fun, folks. Yeah, the answer is 45%. Yeah,
and for those of you that are coming in at 20%, let me throw this statistic to you so you can back that up. One of the ways that you may have heard GLESA, the Great Lakes Integrated Science and Assessment, and the City of Ann Arbor articulate precipitation increase in the past is by saying there's been a 24% increase for the City of Ann Arbor. That number is a conservative estimate, which is arrived at by looking at the average precipitation from 1950 to 80 versus the average of 1980 to 2010. When you compare those two average periods, there's a 23% increase. When you look at just a straight line increase from 1950 to 2010, it's 45%. Either way, it's an increase that exceeds what our system's able to withstand and really puts us immediately into this area that we're going to call the adaptation space, and we're going to be talking about in just a minute.
That's right. Okay, next. Oh, I think this is our last question. What percentage of global surface freshwater do the Great Lakes make up? And this is global surface freshwater? Bing, bing, bing. Congratulations, yes. You are correct. It is 20%. And Beth, what is it just in the U.S.?
80%.
80% of the U.S. is freshwater.
Surface freshwater.
That's very important. Yep. Thank you.
If you took all of the water in Lake Superior and you poured it across the rest of the U.S., it'd be a foot deep. What? So tell that to the rest of the states when they get big ideas. We got all the water. No, sorry, don't say that to them. I'll talk about that too. Compassionate stewardship is a critical adaptation strategy.
And with that, let's turn it over to Beth Gibbons and see what she has to share tonight.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Missy. And thank you for putting those slides up. Emily, and let me see. Let's get into this. Okay. Let me just pause here. So in my remarks tonight, we're going to walk through 4 areas. We're going to have a brief introduction to climate change adaptation and some of what we're adapting to here in the Great Lakes region. We're then going to talk about what I call the adaptation imperative, why we must be acting, what are the reasons that are holding us back, and hopefully boosting us into feeling motivated to then step into a conversation about transformational change, what that means, and then the adaptation opportunity. We'll get a glimpse at what some companies and organizations in our region and beyond are doing in relation to climate adaptation. I'm the executive director of the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. We're an organization dedicated to connecting and supporting people who do climate adaptation work across the country to advance innovation and excellence in the field. We believe that when we do our work well, the result is equitable, ethical, and effective adaptation strategies that address both the changes that are with us and the changes that are coming down the line. When we think about climate change adaptation and climate impacts, we know that scale matters. There's a global, a regional, and a local story. Global trends in climate are more certain than our regional trends. Our regional trends here in the Great Lakes region are really defined by our climate drivers, which for us are those Great Lakes. They are great, and they create their own climate systems. These play a much larger role for us here. Locally, when we think about climate change, the way that I often consider it is that climate impacts are the local manifestation of this global change. And we have a lot of control over the way that those impacts will feel for our community. Choices in our policies, our land use, the way that we pave or don't pave, the preservation of green space, the way that we manage our cities has a tremendous effect on the way that we feel the impacts of climate change. And importantly, the impacts of climate change are not felt equally across all members of our community. And because we really can control what our land use choices are and others, we have a lot of accountability and a lot of opportunity to affect how climate change feels when it's impacting us here. What does that change look like? In the Great Lakes region and consistent here in Ann Arbor, we see that temperatures are rising. It may be hard to believe right now with the polar vortex that we've experienced, but that rising is happening especially in the winter, when the winters are becoming shorter. We're seeing longer falls, what we call our freeze-thaw cycle, where the temperature vacillates over and under freezing, which is, not just a sign of climate change. It's also reflected in our road conditions, which we experience, pretty clearly, and we see that happening both on the fall side and on the spring side. We see spring coming earlier, less ice cover on the lakes. And then, of course, in our precipitation patterns, there's more rain. We see more of that rain is falling in ice storms and these more extreme events. As we often characterize it, the water is coming in big gulps. Less water when we need it, more water when we don't. Precipitation increasing especially in the wintertime, while there's more of a drought that's settling in the summer. And much of that is evidenced by what we're already seeing, the statistic that I threw out about the increases in precipitation. When we think about mapping decision-making as it relates to climate change, we have actually moved past the point that we have to use a lot of imagination about what will we be experiencing. There are very clear questions we can ask ourselves about what has changed. From there, we can say what will change and what are the impacts. But we can begin this journey of thinking about adapting to a changing climate by saying, okay, let's look at our historical experience. Are we using the most up-to-date information? Or probably not. If we update that information, how do we find it impacts our systems? Are our stormwater systems? Are our public facility HVAC systems, are they able to be functional during the heat events? Are they able to function during those extreme rain events? If they're out of their coping range, then what do we need to do? And then you start looking to the future. Pretty soon, you're talking about risk management, not a question about uncertainty of climate change, but really a certainty of needing to change to make sure you're preserving the public goods of the community. When I think about the adaptation imperative, it starts here. Language is an option, but action is not an option. We have seen over and over again the impacts of climate change portrayed in these drastic images: Houston, Duluth, California. We see the impacts of climate change played out across our economy, losses from natural catastrophes. This is not just climate catastrophes, and those numbers are global, $160 billion, $80 billion of that uninsured. We see a devastating humanitarian tragedy, and we see an ever-increasing number of billion-dollar weather and climate disasters. And at the very heart of it, it's because it's getting hotter. We see an increasing temperature globally. 2018 was the 4th hottest year on record. It comes in at 4th. 2017 was the 3rd hottest year on record. But that heat and those impacts aren't distributed evenly. They aren't distributed equitably. These heat and the related impacts, they tend to impact the people who are least responsible for the change, who have the least capacity to adapt to the change, and who are the most likely to continue being injured in this changing climate. It's not just that it's getting hotter right now, and people will often contend that climate change has always been part of our global experience. That's true, and a change in carbon has always been part of the global experience. But what this graphic is showing you is parts per million of carbon concentration over the course of thousands of years. So the bottom axis goes back 800,000 years. You can see where the first red line is drawn across at 300 parts per million, which tells you about the global history, our planetary history of carbon concentration. The circle at the top, nearly off the chart, is where we are now. We are in a time of planetary change, and this is a transformative planetary change. And we're going to talk in a little bit about what that means in terms of the actions that we need to take. Kicking the can down the road is not going to get us where we need to go, nor will waiting to reduce this carbon footprint get us there either. There are actions that need to be taken now. And the myth that people don't want to take action is just that. There is an abdication of leadership at the federal level and at many state levels where there is a willingness not to act despite 70% of people saying that they believe climate change is happening, 70% of Americans saying global warming will harm future generations, and 70% of Americans saying that they value the environment over the economy. In Michigan, that figure is 67%. We are being fooled by a narrative that says climate change is controversial, that valuing the environment isn't well received. We have an opportunity to act on climate change now and to form our own narrative. And we are in a period that I call the adaptation space. This is a time where we have a great sense of what is actually changing. As we look out, and many of you I'm sure have seen this is often called the hockey stick, that you look at climate scenarios and they start to break off. The red line showing us what happens with quote unquote runaway climate change if we keep a business as usual. The blue line is showing us what happens if we dramatically limit our emissions. When we start moving out to those periods post-2070, our climate future can get noisier, has more uncertainty. But right now, in this moment, from now until the 2070, what we would consider a planning horizon, we know what's happening. We know what's changing. Those scenarios put us on a very, very consistent track. And now is the time for us to decide how we want to respond and which of those paths we want to walk down. Climate action and climate adaptation never take place without mitigation. That is a critical part of the adaptation portfolio. And so as we go forward, we want to say, now that we're in the adaptation space, it is this time for action, it is a time we can act with certainty, and it is a time that we can prepare our communities to be going in the direction that we know we want to go when we reach that pivot point at 2070. And we don't need to do this alone. In addition to that 70% of other Americans who feel like you do, that they'd like to be in this room finding out what to do, a lot of others are interested in it too. Moody's Analytics, which is the organization that's a bond rater for cities across the country. They want to know what cities are doing to prepare for climate impacts. Pope Francis wants to know what people are doing to prepare for climate impacts. Bloomberg Philanthropies, the Hip Hop Caucus, AECOM, big companies, small companies, and of course the foundations. This report, Rising to the Challenge Together, from Michigan's own Kresge Foundation, which is a consummate supporter of climate adaptation, and often these foundations represent both the heart and the wallet of nonprofit work, and they are trying to push adaptation portfolios forward. So as we look at this imperative, we see that each one of us has a role, but there are many, many partners that we can be working with. And so then how do we act? We have this question, do we work on transformational change or do we work on incremental change? And I've had a lot of conversations about this over time, and I hearken back to that slide that we looked at of where are we with 400 parts per million? Do we have time to act incrementally? And in fact, are we actually using systems that we want to see advanced? How do we address the fact that people are currently at risk? People have unsafe housing. We have inequitable development in our communities. We're living with systemic racism and injustice. And if we're going to address the planetary change along with those social changes, the action needs to be transformational. That said, people need demonstrable success. They need the example of those tree plantings. They need the examples of the rain gardens. They need the wins so they can see that. They can see the incremental action and say, that's success that my neighbor is part of and I want to be part of it too. And so I encourage you when you go out to do this work, when you go out to work and connect with your colleagues, that you don't set up this dichotomy, but you rather find the way that incremental action can be a path for knowing that we can reach transformational change. Don't let either one of those conversations fall off the table, because we need them both, and we need to be working toward them both. At ASAP, the way that we address this is by establishing what we call our principles of practice. And these principles are not ideas that would surprise most people that have worked in a sustainability or an integrated field. We ask that you use best science and knowledge. And we say knowledge because we know that people who are in communities, whether you're somebody who's living here in Ann Arbor, if you're somebody who is living on a reservation, if you're somebody who is living in a coastal community, you know what the experience has been, and your local knowledge is valuable, your traditional ecological knowledge is valuable, and we want all of those to be brought into decision making. Use projections about future conditions. And that's a hard stop. If you're doing climate adaptation work and you're not looking at future conditions, then you're not doing climate adaptation work, I'm sorry. So that's that. Recognize context. Not everything fits everywhere. We have a deep desire to transfer things from one place to another. Does it scale? Does it transfer? Places are places. People are people. Impacts are local. Accept that and acknowledge that context. Safeguard people and safeguard nature. Work towards mainstreaming. When you can find a winning practice, find a way to integrate that into something someone else is doing already. Better to work together towards a collective goal than try to have a lot of plans that sit on a shelf. Achieve equitable outcomes. This means that there has to be a sharing of power, a sharing of decision-making, a sharing of justice. Think in systems. Avoid harm. This is ever stated, from the medical community to our community, and support mitigation and collaborate. These are basic things, but they're hard to do. And so when you're part of the ASAP community, we ask that you look at your work and you ask these questions. Is my project doing these things? Am I doing these things? What does this mean for my work and my efforts? And how do I move these principles forward? The adaptation opportunity. How am I doing on time? Pretty good? 7 minutes. 7 minutes? Good. All right. I need to wait for my slides to come up because I'm not exactly sure what the next one is. Okay. ASAP is a fun place to be because, as we say, it's a place that people come to when they want to work outside of their sector. It's 25% business, 25% academic, 25% nonprofit, 25% public. It's a real place that people can come and mix and mingle and think about advancing diverse actions. And it's really important that we do this. And these figures had a heading that go with the next slide, so I'm going to kind of allude to it. The really neat growth in the ASAP membership recently has been the private sector. And the private sector is coming to play in two different ways. One, they're providing consultant services. So for a community that wants to do adaptation work, consulting services are starting to realize they better know how to do it. If they're answering a call for a community plan, they better be able to think about climate. Also, they're starting to show up to offer climate information. And while the market can be flawed, the market is also incredibly important in the United States. We follow the market, and we follow market signals. And I put these figures up because 98% of US businesses are small businesses. They provide 55% of US jobs. In Michigan, 96% of Michigan businesses are considered small businesses, and they're providing 50% of Michigan jobs. So if we start thinking about the climate opportunity and climate change adaptation as a new workforce, we see an amazing opportunity that couples pretty closely with that 20% of the nation's surface freshwater that we can be growing into. However, that's not without its threats. After a natural disaster, 40% of small businesses never reopen. So we have to be always balancing and saying we see an opportunity and an opportunity for growth, but it's still going to require that we're preparing for the impacts and we're preparing for the changes that are going to be with us. A couple examples of organizations that are taking these kinds of adaptation measures. One comes from an organization called WUCA. It's the Water Utility Climate Alliance. They represent a dozen of the nation's water utilities and provide drinking water to over 50 million Americans. They have started an initiative where they are looking at utilities and thinking about how does climate change impact every line of this utility. Not just is the water clean or not, they're thinking about customer service. They're thinking about well-being of the employees. They're thinking throughout their business systems, what is climate going to mean for our utilities and how are we going to be sustainable? You can go to the next slide. Another example of a leader in adaptation thinking is the Cleveland Clinic. Cleveland Clinic has 1,400 beds in its Cleveland location and over 4,000 beds across its national campuses. It began thinking about climate change several years ago with the introduction of its SDG goals. Now each year it posts a report that includes these materiality index. You can see where climate adaptation and mitigation is landing, and I think it's in the upper right-hand corner, and it comes with a little line with it that shows how it's been shifting both in importance, especially to the external audiences, but also internally. When Cleveland Clinic addresses climate change, it thinks about its role in three ways. One is, what is the information it can be equitably or ethically collecting about health outcomes of its patients? It thinks about how is the well-being of our own staff? How is the personal and personnel resilience? How are people getting to and from work? How are they coping with climate impacts where they are? And it thinks about its own facility as a refuge, and how can we make our facility a space that will be a resource for our communities that we serve during the time of climate crisis. And I think this is the last one I'm going to chat about. This is Huron River Watershed Council. I mean, what an honor to get to do this work where I do. Between the City of Ann Arbor and HRWC, we see some of the greatest leadership that's available in the country. HRWC started working on climate change probably 6 years ago. They initiated this through a program where they had 3 different stakeholder groups: dam operators, in-stream flow experts, and natural area preservationists. And the story that I love the most is from the dam operators. The dam operators got together and they laid out for them the climate futures. It's going to get stormier. There's going to be more extreme events. What are you going to do when a flood comes down the river? How are you going to talk to each other? And they said, talk to each other? We don't do that. Well, they didn't even have a phone tree. They didn't have any mechanism by which they communicated dam to dam when there was something happening on the river. And so that's what they did. They wrote a phone tree. And it was through the conversation about climate change that they were able to think in systems. They were able to collaborate. And they were able to come up with a simple solution that since then, they've been able to use that phone tree to improve the ecological health of the river by deploying it during times when they're restocking the river and fish are running, they can call upstream now and say, the fish are running, and they've been able to improve the way that the fish move in the stream and other benefits. So it's a place where you see climate change adaptation almost became a co-benefit to the overall health of the river. They also are incredibly sophisticated. If you all don't know that this is happening in your watershed, you should know now. It is one of the most heavily censored watersheds, which means that there are sensors out there watching where water moves from tributaries and reservoirs into the water system. And this is part of an ongoing body of research that also also is happening down in the Detroit area. It's being led by a researcher from University of Michigan named Branko Kirkes. In the city of Detroit, they've established these sensors, and when the water is coming during an event, when they have a big water flow, they're able to read that from their cloud and send out a signal, and they have booms in the pipes, and the booms can deploy in 90 seconds, closing off the pipes. This means that they're able to think about where do we have capacity in our pipes that we can hold water into one area of the system while another area of the system begins emptying out. It's like a third step. When you can't increase your gray infrastructure, when you've added all the green infrastructure, you can get more capacity from your existing infrastructure from this enhanced sensors and deployed technology. Is that it? So, that's my pitch. The climate is changing. Now is the time for action. There's a lot of actions to be taken. There's a lot of people that want to do it with you. And I'd be more than happy at the end of Missy's presentation to talk with you about what we covered in this and any other questions you have on adaptation here or nationally.
Well, everyone, thank you for staying with us. While I work for the City of Ann Arbor now, before that I worked at a national level. So what we had talked about on the panel is I'm going to take you on a national tour of what local communities and indigenous populations are doing. And we don't have enough time to give you the whole smattering, so I intentionally broke down slides for you looking at different types of actions that are unfolding, just because I want to show you what's possible. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the U.S. context, which Beth really did, so I'll fly through that. And then I want to give you a sense of hope of what's really taking place out there, and then areas of future need. And I will potentially do some smattering of what's happening in Ann Arbor, since our Ann Arbor speaker is not going to make it, it looks like. So Beth had this slide too, right? There's a whole bunch that unpacks this, but there's a few things to know. One, the number of natural disasters is on the rise. Two, no part of the country is immune from a natural disaster. Right? If you look at this map, it's not as if you sit in the Midwest and you are safe from a natural disaster. So the cost, so the number of natural disasters on the rise, the cost of natural disasters is also on the rise. And there are two factors for that. One is we're better at calculating the risks or the costs associated with natural disasters, but more than that is the fact the natural disasters are getting more severe, more intense, and they're happening more frequently. And we know this to be true. So this is kind of the narrative. And then, of course, you overlay the fact that the climate is changing. So this is what I was talking about in terms of the number of natural disasters on the rise, and then the cost of those disasters rising. But then lay on the fact that the climate's changing. Beth talked about that beautifully. And here's the thing. We have different scenarios of what our future could look like. Beth kind of presented those. And for those of you who don't kind of eat and drink the climate science, which is most of us, we run scenarios that look at what could happen if. What would the world look like if we continue emitting the way that we are? Or what would it look like if we actually make significant reductions? And these are different possibilities of our future. But here's the thing, we're tracking on that one. This is where we are. We're actually above this scenario. We are not reducing our greenhouse gas emissions at a scale that's commensurate with the problem that we're facing. And so we know that we've got change. Climate change is not an issue of the future. Climate change is an issue right now here. I mean, it's here and now. We are already experiencing the impacts of a changing climate. Beth told you about the increased precipitation we've had in Ann Arbor. Here's a fun stat. I'll ask anyone to call it out. Over the last 30 years, how many more Michigan stadiums of water fall on this city every year? Matt, nod, you can't answer this. I see you leaning over, Matt. You can't give that answer. Does anyone want to throw out a number? Michigan Stadium. Think about that. Enormous stadium. 5, 7, 23 every year full of water falling on our system. Our system can't handle that. It's not designed for that much precipitation. And that's what we're already experiencing today, let alone what's projected to happen into the future. So this is real, right? These are real impacts that we're experiencing. So what does it all mean? I chose to do my work and my PhD research on the local level because that's where we feel the impacts, right? That's where we flood. That's where we feel the wildfire, like the Camp Fire that took place. It's where natural disasters wreak havoc. But it's also the place where we can take action and where we are seeing action. And what we need to do is we need to do this. We need to avoid the unmanageable. Right? So that is, we've got to mitigate. We have to do everything we can to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions because at some point there are things we cannot manage. Now we may be okay in Ann Arbor, but globally there are things that we cannot adapt to. But we also have to manage the unavoidable. And that's acknowledging, again, that the climate is already changing and the impacts are already here. And so we need to do adaptation and mitigation. And we really do need to do it through a lens of social equity because of what Beth talked about, that differential vulnerability. So this is just an example of how Toronto has thought about that as they were going through their planning process. And so what they did is they thought about all the actions they wanted to do to reduce emissions. They thought about all the actions to adapt. And then they said, where are the co-benefits? And we're going to start in the center. Because those are kind of win-win strategies that touch on a lot of the priorities that we have. So let's take a look at what's happening. The way that I structured this is you can look at things from a physical infrastructure change, a green infrastructure change, a policy change. So I want to give you just a smattering of all of those, and then I'm happy to talk about anything else that's happening that I might know about. In addition, I structured it around a basic planning process. This is just kind of an FYI if you're wondering why we're going on the journey we're going on. Starting from, at the very beginning, you kind of have to understand what your risks and vulnerabilities are. And then based on knowing that, you can start planning for those vulnerabilities and risks and how you're going to reduce them, to actually implementing strategies, to monitoring and evaluating, and to going back through with engagement constantly happening throughout that process. So I'm going to start with some vulnerability assessments. This is an example of some work that happened in the 1854 ceded territory. So I was lucky enough to be on the team doing some of this work with 3 bands of Chippewa. And here we were really concerned about the cultural identity of the tribes and how, very viscerally the impacts of climate change were already being felt and manifest in things like no moose. And moose hide is essential for their tribal ceremonies. And so now you don't have hide to make your drums, and then you can't have your drums for your ceremonies. And so what happens? Or what happens when that's your primary food source and you don't have access to that food source? So you may have deer that are coming into the region, but what does that sort of mean and how does that change elders' appetite? And what does it do to your cultural identity and your subsistence way of life? And you can't move, right, is the other thing. In tribal lands, your land is locked. So when those moose leave and go another place, that doesn't mean you get to leave and go hunt them. And so this becomes a really visceral challenge. And so there was an appetite to do an assessment that really focused on those subsistence cultural elements. And so we did a vulnerability assessment that I would say is more qualitative. We didn't necessarily have robust amounts of data about every potential species vulnerability and everything that has ever changed, but we had a lot. And what we also had was that indigenous knowledge about how things have changed. And so going through a process with tribal elders and different tribal stakeholders, we were able to do a qualitative vulnerability assessment that allowed them to understand where to prioritize. And so this is a super simple matrix that looks at how sensitive something is and its adaptive capacity. And based on where it falls, it gives you an indication of where you have high vulnerability, therefore where you probably want to invest your resources. And so this process led into an adaptation plan for the tribe that actually got them a national award for the work that they did. This example is from Miami, Oklahoma. It is not Miami. They will know you are not from there the instant you say Miami. Miami, Oklahoma, this was another project I got to work on where it's a very conservative community. So the only person in that community we could talk about climate change with was our point of contact. But the instant I walked into any room and said climate change, I lost the crowd. Right? Like that's just not their worldview. It is not the way they think about this issue. And so we approached this from a very different perspective. We went in and we talked to people. Beth didn't say this, but she says it a lot if you've ever heard her before, that you always want to start conversations with lived experience, right? You don't want to start with climate change because that's not validating your knowledge and your experience kind of living in this climate. And so we had that conversation with folks. So what have you seen change? Tell me about weather, kind of what's happened over the last 50 years, make them the expert because they are the expert in their place. And then we started having conversations that really focused on their subject matter expertise. So we might talk to a dam operator and we would say, how much rain goes from being a nuisance to a real problem? Oh, okay, it's 4 inches in 24 hours. That's when your system can't handle it. Okay, all right, that's great. And so these became thresholds. the pain points for the different operators within the system. And then we worked with Catherine Hayhoe, a climate scientist, and we modeled how likely those thresholds were to be exceeded into the future and how often they were exceeded in the past. And then we came back to them and we said, it looks like over the last 20 years, you've exceeded that threshold 5 times, and it could increase to 25 in the next 20 years. And they would say, that's unacceptable. We have to do something to adjust the system. And we never had to talk about climate change. Right? And so this was an alternative model that's the same thing. We're still integrating future projections. We're just acknowledging they're not yet ready for that conversation, but they are still experts in thresholds and when there's kind of a point at which the system breaks. And so we use that knowledge. This is an alternative. For many of us, vulnerability is a really negative frame, right? You're thinking about if you get into has anyone done a vulnerability assessment or been part of one? Okay, they're really important and they're great things to do, but you spend your whole time thinking about bad things, right? Like that's it, that's all, okay, it's great, fine, fabulous, wonderful, great, we should do it in the city. That said, in Minneapolis and St. Paul, we did a real life experiment. They both wanted to do a vulnerability assessment. They both were facing similar climate changes, and we decided they were kind of coming at it from a different perspective. Minneapolis wanted to do the traditional, the climate is changing, who's impacted, what do we do about that? And St. Paul said, we want to start from a vision perspective. We want to inspire people first. So we want to paint the vision of what it's going to look like when we're resilient. And then we'll talk about all the things that are preventing us from getting there. But we now have everyone bought into that vision of where we're going. And so it doesn't feel quite as bad, right, to have that conversation. Because now I know why we're having that conversation, right? So it's more positive. I tend to be more in this frame, and this is just a personal difference in terms of what motivates us, but we do know social science tells us more people are motivated by positive things than they are by negative things. So that's kind of a little smattering of the different ways people are doing vulnerability assessments. I want to talk a little bit about planning, and here this is just a smattering of plans to tell you that planning is happening in all different ways, in all different places. Here in Ann Arbor, we have a climate action plan. We have a sustainability framework. These are important things that help kind of pave the way, if you will, set a roadmap for where we want to go. I've never viewed plans as check boxes. Right? They're not, to me, they're not meant to be a thing that you say, did it, did it, did it. They're meant to be kind of indicative of where you're going because circumstances change. Funding could become available. You could have political shifts. The climate could change more rapidly. You could have a disaster. So they're meant to kind of inspire you and give you a sense of where you're headed. When we look at different kinds of plans, I imagine many of you didn't know that Flints master plan integrates concepts related to adapting to a changing climate. So these are some of the ideas that they have embedded within that plan. And amidst everything going on in Flint, they're thinking holistically about how to revitalize their riverfront, but how to do that in a way that's climate smart, and a few other things that you can see up here. Here's another example. Lewis, Delaware. Has anyone ever been to Lewis? It's a super cute town. I would highly recommend it. It's about 3,000 people. They are the first community in the US to integrate climate change into their hazard mitigation plan. This is really, really important. If you look at the number of communities that have a standalone climate adaptation plan, a few years ago it was 44. I think today it's probably closer to about 50. If you look at how many communities have a hazard mitigation plan, the number is 25,000. If you can find a way to integrate climate change into a plan like that, you just tipped the scale. So FEMA, for those who may not know it, FEMA now requires that states consider climate change in their hazard mitigation plans, and you have to do a hazard mitigation plan at the state level, it's required. At the local level, you have to do it to be eligible for funding, and so that's why there are so many people who do this. Now, considering climate change technically means you could say we considered it and it doesn't count, it doesn't matter. So technically that could happen. We haven't seen that yet. There is no requirement for localities to integrate climate change unless you live in California, and then the state has required it. But this was part of my PhD work, was figuring out how do we do this? I mean, how do you actually integrate climate change into your hazard mitigation plan in a way that moves the needle and not just saying it up front, the climate is changing, but then nothing shifts in your plan, right? So this is exciting what Lewis did, and they really have paved the way for people like New York City and others who we kind of consider vanguards in this work. Speaking of New York City, I put this one in because of that connection between adaptation and mitigation. So a lot of times we hear about New York and it can feel like it's not us, but there are so many extraordinary things happening in this city that I applaud and I feel like we can continue to learn from. Everything from their plan to limit greenhouse gas emissions to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which means pretty much going towards carbon neutrality, hard and fast. And then it's also, they have a green infrastructure plan, they have a resilience plan, equity. All of this is kind of integrated into the culture and ethic of how New York City operates. It's really exciting to see what's emerging in this place. I'd also say one of the things I'm following from an Ann Arbor, kind of switching hats really quick, is New York City has made a commitment to divest their pension, right? And so I would like to see Ann Arbor do the same. Because if New York City can divest that pension, we can divest our pension. So I want to see that happen. And we're working really closely with our colleagues there that are working on that initiative. So that third bubble then is around implementation. So I just want to give you some examples of what's kind of happening. Grand Rapids, on Thursday, the Michigan Climate Action Network will have their meeting here. And one of the things that I really appreciate about Grand Rapids is little examples like this. This is a pocket park that used to be an abandoned lot that when you talk to the residents, they felt unsafe. They felt, and they knew that a lot of illicit activity was happening on the corners in this space. They also had a flooding problem in this neighborhood. And so the city planners there worked with the community and they said, we want to handle, we're really concerned about that flooding issue because that's kind of the angle they were coming at. But we think we can do a lot of other cool things in this space. So what can we do? Help us design this lot. And so what they actually designed was a park, right? And it infiltrates 100% of the water that falls on site. So the flooding is abated. And they have neighborhood grandmas who come out and watch the corners. The kids play in this. This space is completely activated in a way that it wasn't 5 years ago. And this is a win-win strategy, right, where the community got what they needed and the city got some flooding abatement. And so we're seeing more and more of these kinds of projects emerge where we acknowledge those co-benefits that can emerge. And then this, Keene, New Hampshire was actually the first community that did a climate adaptation plan in the nation. One of my favorite stories is the planner there at the time who did this. Her name was Michaela. Then I was at the nonprofit ICLEI when she was working on this plan. I remember her getting a phone call from New York City asking, how do we do that, right? To be in Keene's claim to fame, other than the first climate adaptation plan, which obviously is what makes them so popular, is Jumanji was shot here. So that's mostly what people know. But they started the adaptation planning process because they had a massive flood, precipitation event, they flooded, and a little girl lost her life in the flood. And then they said, never again. Never again will that happen, but we don't know how. We don't know how to do this. And so they went through this planning process. They worked with the state climatologists. They brought in nonprofits, and they created the model, the very first guidebook for how to plan for climate change. And their number one strategy was actually mitigation, and then it was all common sense things like this. Every time we touch a culvert to replace it, we size it for climate change. Because the cost difference when we're already replacing a pipe is pretty darn small to have to upsize it and make sure it's connected to the system in an effective way. And so they're making these kinds of replacements. It's just a lighter financial load. And there are a whole bunch of other things they're doing. But this is an example of a physical infrastructure change that's happening. Here in Ann Arbor, we have a stormwater utility that many of you probably know about. So we do a flyover, and then we're all assessed based on the amount of impervious surface that we have on our lots, and you can get rebates and reductions. And our third speaker just walked in, so I won't talk too much about this. If we have time, she can highlight it. But this is a way, like if you do a rain garden or you have a rain barrel, your fee will actually be reduced based on that. And this funds our green infrastructure in the city. Our urban forestry work is funded through this. This is a really great program, and Jen in the back gets a lot of credit for moving this forward. Talking about a policy change in Boston, Massachusetts, the big issue that they're really concerned about is, of course, sea level rise. And so they have been working on a number of initiatives, but the one I want to point out here is the Redevelopment Authority has required anyone applying to do any redevelopment, major redevelopment, or new development has to prove that they've integrated climate change into their designs. And this is twofold. They have to demonstrate that they integrated future projections of sea level rise, which they give them. And they tell them, you're not going to make up a number. Here's the number you have to plan for. And then they say, we also want to know what you're doing to reduce your carbon footprint. From an adaptation side, they say, if you don't do this, this is how they got this through. If you do not integrate projections of climate change, when a disaster happens, because it will, the city is responsible for getting all of those people out. It's on us, and we're not taking that risk. So you are not going to put us in risk by not being smart. And you want to develop in Boston, you'll do this. And if you're a developer, you want to develop in Boston. New York is following suit, and others. So these kinds of strategies don't actually curtail development. And in fact, we're seeing it increase more development because people want to be branded as being climate smart. And it's a good business model, broadly speaking. We can talk about some companies that are doing that work. Bringing it a little more closer to home, In terms of a green infrastructure strategy, Chicago, Illinois has kind of been branded as the what do I want to say, green roof capital of the US, and many others have taken off, but they did some fabulous work, and there are studies showing the difference. So there are 2 roofs in this picture. For you guys, on the left side, you can see the city building. On the right, you can see the county. In the middle of summer, it was an incredibly hot day. The difference in those 2 roofs was about 50 degrees. Right, because it cools. And then the difference in the building and the energy usage of that, when normalized, was significant. I don't remember the numbers, so I'm not going to throw it out, but I have it in the slide to share with you. But this is significant. I mean, these are real cost savings that people are accumulating through that. They've also done something in Chicago, which I would love to see us do throughout the Midwest, which is activate your alleyways. So we have a lot of alleys, and they transitioned all of them, not all of them, but many of them, into pervious pavement, so it absorbs stormwater, and then they put out things like benches. And so people are actually coming out into the alleyways. They're being reactivated, and they're managing increased precipitation. So just a few more, and I'll stop. El Paso, right? So as we're thinking about drought and extreme heat, this is just an example of some of the work that they're doing, especially around education and engagement. In certain parts of the US, we have population change. I think it's in Waveland, Mississippi. The average resident is only there 4.5 years. So if you have that kind of a turnover, you constantly have to be doing education and engagement, especially around risks, like how do you handle a hurricane when it comes in, because you shouldn't assume that people know that kind of information. So education and some disaster response is pretty important for what's happening in El Paso, amongst many other things at the moment. And then the last city-specific example I want to give is from Seattle. This is one of my personal favorites. Seattle has a Department of Neighborhoods, and their entire job is to activate neighbors. And the theory behind this, or I guess the goal behind this, is in the case of a disaster, a true disaster, the city can't be everywhere at one time. It's impossible, right? There's just not enough resources. And so their goal was, how do we get residents to take care of each other with no city or government intervention for 7 days if a disaster happens? And the way they decided to do that was to help neighbors get to know each other. And so it's everything you imagine, from simple signs that every person gets that says, I'm fine, I need help, right? Because if telecommunication systems go down, you may not be able to communicate, so you can put that in your door. They help organize neighborhood block parties so people get to know each other. They have little utility closets that everyone gets to share resources, so not everyone has to have a hammer or a chainsaw. There's one that everyone can use over time, and you collectively share it. There's all kinds of different strategies that they are putting in place, and I think this is really, really important. Social cohesion is one of the most important factors in terms of increasing resilience. And it's true if you look at the Chicago heat wave, in terms of health outcomes, who survived and who didn't, one of the underlying factors was social cohesion and safety. And then lastly, I just want to leave with regional initiatives. So climate impacts don't stop at geopolitical boundaries, right? They don't care where the difference is between Ann Arbor or Ypsi or Saline. It's irrelevant. And so we need to be thinking regionally in terms of the actions that we're taking. This was the first regional collaborative that really took off, the Southeast Florida Climate Change Compact. It is the 4 counties on the tip of Florida. And they partner. It took them a long time. They actually gave up a little bit of their own individual autonomy and said, we're going to work collaboratively on a number of things. We're going to plan for the same sea level rise projections. We're going to integrate our water systems and make sure that we're thinking holistically about impacts. For sea level rise, we're going to use the same design jams. We're going to use the same strategies in terms of land use, because we're connected and it doesn't stop. They also they do activism together. So they'll go to the state house or federal level and they'll talk about the impacts they're experiencing, make the economic case. This is a really powerful model. They have an annual summit as well that draws 200, 250 people just to talk about what's happening in Southeast Florida. So in terms of the last step in that, monitoring and evaluating, I just wanted to say we don't have a lot. What we really have is New York City. New York did something that is super fabulous, and that is Mayor Bloomberg acknowledged that political winds blow. And what was really, really important was to institutionalize this work. So he got a resolution through that requires that Ann Arbor, that would be great, that New York City reports annually on their progress towards their actions. So a new mayor can come in, and it's a strong mayor system. So the mayor could say, I don't care about climate change, but every year they have to say that. And it has to be public, and then the citizens know. So there is at least some accountability within that. So I think The last slide kind of tying up, those are just some like rapid examples of what's happening around the nation. We still need more work about what's happening in practice. No practitioner is paid to tell their story. So we have a dearth of knowledge about what's actually happening. And sitting at the City of Ann Arbor, we're connected to a lot of different folks, and we try to extract their stories, and in situations like this, try to share those. And we also need help with financing this work and thinking really creatively. The kinds of solutions that we really do have to do for transformational adaptation they're not going to be cheap. The cost of inaction is going to be much more significant. But how do we create kind of financing models to actually do this work? We need to be able to measure progress and understand what success actually looks like. I can't read most of these backwards. It's really hard to read this backwards. We have to figure out how to achieve carbon neutrality. And what does that actually look like in practice? We have some ideas, I think, along the path of how we get there, but how do we do that, and how do we do that equitably, and how do we do that through a resilience lens? You saw transformative in here.
State level.
Oh, and state level initiatives. We need more support at the state level. In Michigan, I can't change our building code in Ann Arbor. That is not something we have the authority to do. So we need to have enabling legislation and states that are supportive and moving in the same direction that we are, or else we'll continue to be limited by what we can do. So this kind of is where I started. We have to manage the unavoidable. We have to avoid the unmanageable, and we've got to make sure that equity is front and center. And to me, that's the core of resilience that we're talking about. So that is it. We want to get you out on time. So
Do I get to do the intro for Jen? Since
we
you got
don't
to do
actually
mine?
have time.
But I can introduce her.
Yeah,
Right?
you want to
Does everyone know who she is?
Yeah, introduce Jen.
This is Jennifer Lawson. I think she's a stormwater manager for the City of Ann Arbor, but I sometimes Jen is amazing. Anytime that I have the opportunity to get to hear her present on the work that's happened in the City of Ann Arbor, I realize what honor it is to be in an area that is taking such incredible action. She's somebody who understands that intersection of incremental and transformative and can come up with really pragmatic solutions. She knows stormwater knowledge, water infiltration, water systems like the back of her hand. I looked at her slides to see if I could give them, and I threw them away and laughed and was like, no. But so she is somebody that for your local questions about what's happening here and what's possible, she is an amazing resource. Thanks for joining us, Jen.
Thank you for having me. I do want to point out that there's more people in this room than there is in city council chambers right now. And there are some pretty hefty things on the agenda tonight for city council. So kudos to you all.
Jen, do you maybe want to give one or two examples of what's happening in Ann Arbor?
So as Beth mentioned, my purview is stormwater. My purview is actually all things water, drinking water, stormwater, sanitary sewer, and kind of how all of those systems interact and how they all work together. So I'm very fortunate to be in kind of this wonderful community who understands the importance of stormwater, and they're willing to fund some amazing stormwater opportunities. We're looked at as leaders in the Midwest. It's not just in the state. I mean, I get phone calls from across the country asking, how did we do something? How do we get our residents to care? Which is amazing. So again, thank you to you all. I actually pulled up a really interesting slide, and I'm a big numbers person. I'm a scientist at heart. And just by show of hands, Ann Arbor residents in the room, how many of you have a rain garden in your yard? Raise your hand. So your rain garden is one of 277 residential rain gardens in the city. Those 277 residential rain gardens treat 3 million gallons of stormwater runoff annually. That's a pretty cool number. That's amazing for just that residential impact. The one that I'm proud of is the city number. So there are 124 green infrastructure things in the city, bioswales, rain gardens. We treat 403 million gallons of stormwater annually. That's a huge kudos to the city and to the residents who support that program. So Missy was talking about some of the programs that Portland's doing and Seattle's doing and Grand Rapids is doing. They're the ones that are calling us. They're the ones that look to us and go, wow, you have 277. And I should say that number's counting. This number was actually as of about 6 months ago. So just some of that data and the numbers behind what we're accomplishing, I really think this community needs to be proud of where we're going with this, and there's no stopping us.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you all for sticking with us. We are at the end of our time. Please join me in thanking our fabulous panelists and yourselves for participating.
This program was recorded on February 19th, 2019, at the Ann Arbor District Library.